All right, everyone, welcome to the first video in a Dose of Drew. I am said Andrew of Dose of Drew. Today, we are going to be seeing what we can do about getting to helping some people understand what physicists, mathematicians, and a lot of other people mean when they say they believe that mathematics is like trying to read the mind of God, or trying to see the mind of God, or it's the language of God, or it's the language of the universe, and all that sort of stuff. A lot of people take that as to be extraordinarily, conceited, I guess is a good word. Self-centered, anthropomorphic, anthropocentric. There's a lot of words you can use to do it, but really it's human-centered, right? Humans can look at the mind of God as what it presupposes, and a lot of people don't like that. I actually agree with that, but we're going to see if we can't try and fix some of the problems with it. At the same time, explain to people why a lot of people feel that, even if they can't say it right. And I'm going to do it with this blank white sheet. White is good. It works very well as part of a representation. Let's not forget what we're doing is a representation. It's not a reality, because the only way to actually do a reality is to look at the universe. So we're going to have to represent it in something small. Doing something white helps because it makes it a nice little analogy, and it lets it go across scale and across multiple things for a metaphor and analogy. It also happens to be the only color I have, and I only have a dark dry erase marker, so if it was black, it really wouldn't be something you could see. So there's a practical consideration that really goes with it as well. Also, I'm going to use this one stone. And if you get that reference, you're awesome. So, first things first. We're going to go back. A lot of people like to think of it as counting. You start off with one, a rock. We're going to go ahead and establish a couple things. One, this rock is like many other rocks. There's a lot of stuff that goes with it. There's other things that I could do, like a stick, though it won't work quite as well as this rock, because this rock is kind of, just average, random, lots of different pieces. It has lots of different things to it, so we'll go with it. I could have gotten like a stick or a cylinder, which would be another type of object that would be different, or something like a shell that's like a snail shell or something like that has the spiral that starts out small and goes. Those are all two different kinds of things that we can work with, but I'm going to just try and do it with this one stone. First definition, we're going to go with this one stone. This is one stone. I can break the stone into another piece. If I break the stone into two pieces, those two smaller pieces are going to be sufficiently similar enough to this one and to each other to say that they are two of the same kind of stone, two of the same kind of thing. So we'll start with that kind of stuff. That's the kind of thing. If you break a shell, it's not exactly the same. If you break a cylinder in half, the two halves are the same, but they're not the same as the original. That's an important distinction when we're talking about what we're going to be talking about. So let's talk about the things that when we break them up or when we add them together, they're essentially similar enough to each other to be considered the same thing. That's what we need to make sure of. That it is irrespective of the size or scale when we talk about this. That's going to be important. For those of you who don't understand what I just said, that is okay. The rest of what I'm going to say should still make sense. For those who understand what I just said, by all means, tell me if you want to hear me talk about the other stuff. There'll be more that comes like that. But please, if you already like this, like, subscribe, hit a comment, smash whatever. I'm not sure what else you do on YouTube, but let's go with it. That being said now, first things first, if we can call that one, but it's not everything, let's just go to here. Most people start with saying there was nothing, and then there was something. That can't be true. There's no such thing as a nothing without a frame in it of everything. All. Let's start with that concept first. All. This is an important one. Everything. Not quite the same. Thing needs to come out of that. All. All that is, all that is not, all that could be, and let's get something else straight. Possibility is something within that set. There is nothing outside of it. First definition, all is everything. There's not a universe outside of it. There's not a bracket outside of it. Everything is included. There is no other framework. If you find something new, it gets included in this, not outside of it. There is no existence or non-existence or any concept or anything you can get that is outside of that group. All is all encompassing. There's not something outside of it. It's a hard thing for most people to understand. It's like, but I can think of something that's outside of it. I can think that all doesn't include it. You're reducing all to something that fits instead of putting the way it should be. All means all. There's nothing outside of it. We'll start there. If that's true, there is no other else. There is only one, and we'll do it this way, all. That's the first one. Okay? There's only one all. There's no two alls, otherwise they're not all. You can have multiverses, omniverses, everything in there, whatever you want. It's still part of the one and only set of all. There's only one all. Now, with that being said, let's think about that. Let's put a circle around this. I'll draw some bounds so it's easy to do, and because it's a cool play on my name. This, we'll say, is all. Simply because we put bounds on it is so we can imagine it. Let's never forget that when we do this, this isn't actually all. This is something that's representative so we can understand it or we can imagine it. If this is all, and I take this little thing, and I say, whatever is encompassed by those little bounds within this bigger bounds, well, that's another one. Right? As long as we can do that, and I can put a little bounds around this, and I can say anything within that is, say, a rock. This rock, separate from everything else, all that is not that rock. This little thing, and all plus this plus all that is not it equals all. That's an important concept. But I pull this out. Let's also remember that there's real things that separate this, but the characteristics that we use to describe it are things we put on it. This little boundary is an imaginary separation. Let's never forget that. But let's take a look. Since we're trying to represent reality here, let's talk about reality. If that is partly true, right? We know that this plus all equal this plus all that is not it equals all. It's weird, right? To sit there and say something like, oh, the first one plus, whatever, is weird. But the first thing you got to realize is you take all minus whatever that other thing is, and it equals somehow 1. That's an imaginary thing. It can't be true. So let's just get over that. Because we're trying to represent reality, we'll go a different direction. Besides, I don't want to use a whole bunch of numbers and equations. So we'll just do that. Let's talk about reality. We're trying to do it. As long as we're not talking about all anymore, because that's a hard concept. We're talking about this one little thing we separated out. We're doing it with this rock. It's important to realize that we're establishing that this rock is like all other rocks. So we'll do that. But let's take this first. This rock came from a bigger rock. If I break this rock in half, there's going to be 2 other rocks that are similar. So if there's one that we can put a thing around, this came from a bigger one and I can break this down, we're going to talk about across scale. Whether I make this circle huge or I make it small, they're essentially similar. So that tells me that if I have this rock and then I can break that up, and if I have all of the same characteristics, but I break it and now it's separate, well, that means I could have another one of these. That's another one. Right? I could go pull another rock. I could go pull another stone. But if there's one and it came from others or if there's one and it can be broken, it establishes you can either break it in half or you can have 2 of them. Let's just go with that, right? So first off, here we go. If there's one like this, that implies there's the possibility of another one where you can break it up so that there's 2 that are now similar, that are just different in size or scale than the previous one. This similarity, we're going to presume, is implied. And if it implies that there's one, well, I could break it into 3, I could break it into 4. So if there's one, then it implies that there's another. And if there's another, that implication gives me 2. Now, once we have 2, there's something else. Like if I broke this rock in half, since we're starting with 1, well, there's 2, but there's also the group of them. If you're taking, it's not just 1 and 1, because that's not 11, right? That's a whole nother number. We're not there yet. We're still trying to figure out how we get past 1. So if there's 1 and 2, we're going to call that 2. Well, there's 2 things in there, right? So there's 1, 1, and then there's the group. That implies a 3 with the grouping. That 1 implies another 1. The 2 makes 1, 1 plus the group, 3. That's the 3 and 1. The trinity that leads to a particular type of infinity. Now, we'll go ahead and leave that right there for a moment. If you want to hear talk about that a little bit more, about a trinity that leads to infinity, by all means, mark it in the comments. Go ahead and tell me, send me something that says, I want to hear more about that. Now, let's talk about the rest of this. Everything that's not this rock, or the original rock, or the biggest rock, or all rocks like this, right? All rocks, everything that has these same characteristics. This isn't a shell, this isn't anything. This is something that's just a rock. It has very particular characteristics. Now, once we've established that this little thing is out here, doing this little thing, that these are the rocks, right? Every rock that can be do this. There could be one, there could be many, but it's all grouped together as that kind of rock, that kind of stone. Right now, we're still sticking with 1 stone. Now, everything else that is not this one, we'll take this one away and we'll just keep it as all, because it's a whole different concept right now. Everything else that is not this one, all the rest of this, all that is not this one, right? This one is 2, right? So we'll go 1, 2, and then the group of them together is 3. So if you start adding them together, and then of course, once you have 3 plus another one, it implies, forever, n plus 1. Within that group, within this rock, there's an infinity. That single rock, there's an infinite. As long as this pattern holds, let's establish that first. As long as this pattern of going up and down in the same, then we can call it with the very same characteristics. All of the stuff we say makes this a rock, we're going to presume that this can go, for the moment, up and down in scale. We can make a bigger rock or a smaller rock until we get to a certain point where there's no longer a characteristics where we can say, well, that's a rock. That's the same thing. One molecule of this rock may or may not be the same as this. So there becomes a point in time where this may break down. But we'll leave that for right now. There's also different kinds of things. Is it the same thing? Does it become? We'll leave that. But everything that doesn't fit that is all that is not 1. Right? It's not all that is not this kind of 1. That's the rest of everything. Let's just be real. Possibility doesn't exist outside of all. It just doesn't. It does not exist outside of all. It can't. You can't have it outside of there. So let's just make sure that possibility is something that's included in this, all that is not this rock. Hope you all are still with me on this. Now let me understand something again. You want to start talking about several things. I'm going to put this rock just outside here so we can do that. Let's make sure we understand something else real quick. If I have this rock, right? This one rock, whatever it is, then I have all that is not it, and I add those together. I've got all that is the one rock plus all that is not the one rock, and I get nothing. I'll even put that through there so it doesn't look like an O, like my O up there, just so you can see it. So right there, in that little bit, we just established that if we can pull apart something and say that there's something that we can call 1, and there's everything else that is not 1, then we come back to 0. Well, 0 is not really a thing. If you go out there in the physical reality, there's no such thing as nothing. There's really not there. This is a balancing act between these. And it really is an imaginary definition between what we call this and what everything else that is not it is. It is a definition that is a human one. There's very real things as far as this goes that we understand very, very well are real. It becomes an extraordinary thing that as we go through this and we try and represent it, that this becomes something we forget. We are representing this. This is the original representation. All other numbers, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 up until all that, are representations of groups. It's all a different way to represent something in reality. We know that some of this is true. We know that there's a difference between this rock, this paper, this pen that are not exactly the same. So there is the ability to make this. This pen is a one, but it's a different kind of one. So we're going to go ahead and ignore that so that we can sit here and say, well, it's a different kind of one, but as long as we're going to say that it's all the same kind of thing as this, then we can still call it a one. It's unique. There's not two of them. This is a real thing. This is true. It must be. We can interact with it. The differentiation, though imaginary, also is as real as our imagination. So as we go through this, we try and figure out, how does this apply? We look for this pattern. The goal of science and mathematics and all of that stuff, or more appropriately, when science uses mathematics, is that we try and establish that this is what we're doing. We find where this pattern works. Because quite honestly, we can't understand anything that's not this pattern. I'll let that sit in for a minute. We can't understand anything that's not this pattern. We can understand the iteration between these, this breaking down into something else, a sun doing it, and the deconstruction of things that are one into all that is not one. But that differentiation creates an unusual pattern. And for those who know what that pattern looks like, it starts to, my opinion, and I am not a mathematics PhD or anything like that, but in my opinion, it starts to look a bit like the Mandelbrot set. When you start getting into things like imaginary, the square root of all that is not one, you start getting into weird stuff. You start finding out that all that is not one is not one. It's made up of lots of pieces, which we look at this and it's true. We can sit there and say, well, yeah, that makes sense because this is what we're trying to represent. This is where it originally comes from. So we start going and we say, hey, there's stuff that's not one. There's a pattern to that. And then we start learning, well, the Mandelbrot set's really iterated. So there's a time factor inherent to it. Whether we want to admit it or not, there's a time factor in the Mandelbrot. We're representing it. If you're going to iterate so that the next one, you're assuming in the process, there's an algorithm to make that Mandelbrot. You do this, and after 1 and 1 and 1, the time in the Mandelbrot equation and in the all that is not one is assumed. Well, let's make this clear. It's either assumed or emergent. I'm on the emergent side. I believe that as these things go and these little differentiations happen outside of that we start to become, well, hey, time happens. Because these things have to break down to be one and not one and what is and what is and what is. And the more this happens, the more it is. The more possibility there is for this, the bigger certain things get. There's a real energy to possibility. Can't prove it. I don't have the proof to it, but we'll go with the logics here. This is far from a rigorous proof. Please excuse me if I am lacking in specific knowledge of the language in order to do the rigorous and complete proof, but I'm working on it. I'm still learning. So once we get to this, you have this right here. And we can just do this. We'll do this another way because a lot of people will like this one, I hope. Where we say this is one as well, but it is the one that has 2 and 3. So we'll go with that now. We'll just stick with that. This is the one that implies n. Well, and I hate to do that, but this is the one that implies a certain type of infinity. As long as this pattern holds, there's an infinite number of those that we can do within this all. As long as we do it. Now, there should be patterns that do that. Since there's characteristics, there's things we do with that, but we'll just leave it there. Again, this is the 3 and 1. The 1 that implies a 2, and then there's the group of them that implies a 3, and if you put a 3, then there's a 4. This is the 3 and 1 that implies a certain type of infinity. The trinity that leads to an infinity. Again, We'll just leave it there. All that is not one. If you wonder what I'm talking about, rock, book. This is one. This is one. All these things. It is not a rock. It is part of all that is not one, unless you turn this into say, well, this is one too. Yes, just like that. There's many things we can do, but there's books and stuff. So let's just make sure that we talk about things that may or may not be different, but anything that we can establish, whether it be through space, time, or some other characteristics, as a singular entity. This is important. As far as we can tell, when we look out in the universe, this is what we see. Everything we see fits in this. We look out, we see spiral galaxies. We look out, we see the rest of the stuff. We try and establish what makes them both separate and together. We try and establish what makes them one and part of all that is not one, whatever that is. This is what we talk about when we talk about looking at the mind of God, because every time you try and figure out what a proton is, every time you try and figure out, you're trying to figure out how this works. You're trying to figure out where this starts, where it ends, where it breaks down. The presumption many people have is that this pattern will continue across scale infinitely or indefinitely. And we know at this point that's not true. We know that this does not go up to everything. There is not anything out there that looks just like a human. There's a lot of anthropocentric stuff. There's the homunculus theory. There's all sorts of things that go with that, but it's just not there. Now, let's talk about the difference between zero, which right now we'll just, if you look at all this, that this one thing we pull apart, whether it be a person or not, and all that is not that one thing equals zero, well, Zen and all that. That's one thing. If we take a look at this at a bigger thing, we realize there's really only a single one. This down here is actually part of a probability. It's a part of a bigger whole. It is a percentage of it, even though we can call it one from our perspective. So let's think about that for a minute. There's really only a single unitary, and that's the one that is all. And it is present throughout all. That one is all. And I hope there's some comic nerds out there who are marveling at what I just did. That the one that is all is present throughout all. Anyway, back to this, because that's still true. As we start to look at this, let's think about the null, right? There's a difference between zero and null. If you don't understand that, comment in there and I'll be happy to talk about it. Let's talk about this a little bit. We're looking at this open circle here to denote this one, right? Let's think about the null. If we think about null, that is by notation, the empty set, right? It is a set without anything. Again, the empty set can't be outside this. It has to be in by definition. So what is the empty set? Well, if we're looking at this, if we were to talk about like a rock, if a normal rock, we're talking about ones and ones, it would be a set with a rock in it. It's essentially a little circle with a rock in it. Instead of this, we'll just go like this instead of the brackets. Well, a set with nothing in it is essentially a point, right? Instead of a little circle, it's just a dot. It is still a one, right? It's a unit, but let's make sure we understand this. This is a representation. There is more than one null, even though there's only one null set representation. You can have a lot of little points out here that have no interior. Maybe that's a little geometric and I'm doing it in a two-dimensional way, but if you understand what I'm saying on that, number one, you're awesome. Number two, please comment and like, subscribe. If you don't understand what I'm saying, you want me to describe that in more detail, because right now I'm still going fast, by all means, comment and let me know. But in the end, the null set is a empty interior or a no interior point within this all set. All right, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, but let's just start over. There is the one that is all. There is within it something else that you can call one, even though it's not the one, it is a percentage, but we'll go that. But if you understand that all is also all that is not one, right? All that is not that one. So even these little dots, all this rock, everything like that, when you start talking about all, you start talking about all these little pieces, it's all that. You can represent all that is not that one the same way. And if you get this whole thing and you realize that this is the set that is all plus all that is not 1 equals, we call it 0. You know what? I'll call it nothing. Or more importantly, no thing. Because there's a reality to the way we describe this. If we're talking about a group of 2 rocks versus 1, the difference between 2 rocks and 1 rock, well, in this group, it's 1 rock. So we'll talk about a difference. 1 stone is the difference in that thing. So the difference between all and all that is not is no thing. So you either have to have something that is both. Quite honestly, 0 is both, right? You need to have something that is both in order for it to be no thing. So we start making these little, all the stuff we do, whether it be a dot. These boundaries, again, imaginary. The separation of that is something that's also within all. Space, time, everything within there. Separation is still a characteristic of all, so it's something that we only see. Now we can start talking about perspective, but I'm going to leave that be. Again, you want to hear me more about this? This is something out there. This is Drew, a dose of Drew. I did a little bit of philosophy on your Sunday fun day. If you like it, by all means comment. If you don't like it, by all means comment. If you think I'm completely wacko, by all means, please comment. If you think I'm a crazy genius, by all means, please comment. I love all you guys. Thank you for tuning in. If you watch this, I hope you like it. Have a great day.